Hello. Alright. So, I finished the game and did all the stars. Wasn't there like a secret ending with all the stars? But I don't even know. What would that be? Like what do I need to do to go like through that whole level again? I don't know. I think I'll go with a commentary. See how it goes. So there is like new controls that you do. The bumpers.
This disables subtitle full screen to see things better. On for a while so you can the game is paused. Minimize them for best visibility or minimize them if you just want to play the game. When commentary is done and you go on to illustrations, this is an example subtitles automatically, but often there will be illustrations which are treated the new.
Alright, so yeah, it speeds up by minutes, but you can't restart it if you reach the end. Alright. The Clouds Bridge?
We've touched up the graphics and sound for this edition of Braid, but if you want to play with the original graphics and sound, you can switch at any time. These are the old graphics, and these are the new graphics. The commentary world is all new, so there are no old graphics to switch to when you're back there. It only works here in the main game.
Alright. Is that commentary here? Guess not. Well, let's start in counterclockwise. Chris Moore. Is it all no, like Brian? The Moriarty is the guy who was in that Eclipse part. He's like a Professor Moriarty who was giving a lecture for like 40 minutes while the Eclipse and the Witness happened. So I don't think he's a part of the team, but maybe again influenced the game somehow. Let's see. Chris Moore. Conversation with Chris Moore.
It's April 2022, and I am here in Santa Fe, New Mexico with Dr. Chris Moore of the Santa Fe Institute. Or how would you like people to know you?
Herr Doctor Professor, of course. Or I think it's Herr Professor Doctor, actually.
You do have hair.
I do
Quite
have
long
hair. Yeah,
yes.
Thank you.
So we've made some experiments and talked for a while about what's the best way to concretely convey useful information and thoughts about the game. And it seems to work very well to play through the game from beginning to end and just comment on what we see and what we think about it. And really the goal of this conversation is to talk about what Chris likes and thinks is interesting, because I can do what I like later, right, anytime.
Yeah, so we're going to play through the game and focus on my favorite puzzles and like what their structure is, what they're teaching the player, kind of those moments of aha and revelation that the game produces, and how each one teaches you how to use the mechanic, often in a new way. And then I guess we'll use those individual puzzles as jumping off places for talking about sometimes the game as a whole and the design philosophy behind the game. And yeah.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Alright. Making rewind interesting early in the game. Artful misdirection.
So the first world is like, okay, here's how to run, here's how to jump. And it's like, oh, I know how to do this. And then a couple puzzles in, you're like, okay, we have all these monsters. What we do is, I mean, they're cute monsters, but still, you kill monsters, right? That's what you do.
That's what I heard, yeah.
And the wonderful thing about this puzzle is the way this becomes one of the themes which recurs later on in the game, like a variation on a theme, where as the mechanics change, we see puzzles that look like this, but have very different solutions. Okay, bonk, bonk, bonk. We bonked all the guys. Oh, damn it, how do I get over there? If only that guy were still there. From like a computer science point of view, a greedy strategy isn't always the right one. You might want to look ahead a little bit and not immediately do the thing which seems naively like making progress. So these trolls, these monsters, they're not just opponents. They're going to turn out to be really vital resources.
They call them trolls?
In how we solve the puzzles. And this is the first little hint of that. And it's only 1 out of the 6, but it's already kind of a deep lesson, which I really like, because when you first enter this world, it's like, oh, I know what to do. I can just go bonk, 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 and then I'm done. But not quite.
Yeah, not quite. Now, you know, when I was first coming up with this puzzle, it was in the earliest prototype of the game, I think. And so first I was like, what can I do to make a puzzle out of monsters? And then, of course, what's interesting or difficult about needing to bounce off a monster? It's like, oh, let's sort of misdirect people into, you know, bonking the monster off the screen that they need, right? And so this is sort of one of the first places in the game where we apply misdirection.
When they see this, because of the whole trope, the genre of platformers, they think they immediately know what to do.
Yeah. Yeah. And so now the thing I didn't think about, or, you know, I thought about it way before release, but
The genre of
immediately upon designing the puzzle, is that this puzzle, and so now the thing I didn't think about, or, you know, I thought about it way before release, but not immediately upon designing the puzzle, is that this puzzle actually could be pretty hard if you don't like sit back and have the right mindset. Because what happens is you come up here, you get rid of all the monsters. Now there's 2 monsters left, and you try to get across the gap, and now you realize you have a problem. And you look at the screen to try and solve the problem. What tools do I have at my disposal to solve this problem?
Right.
And of course, the thing that solves the problem is gone. There is no visual clue that it was there, and you might not even remember that there happened to be one right there. You might vaguely remember, oh, there's some other monsters on the screen. And so this puzzle is harder for some people than I had expected because of that element, right? And that's why it's interesting being a game designer sometimes.
But it would be only harder because they wouldn't know at this point how to rewind time, I think. Or that they can go back through the door and then come back and it will reset all of them. What is this? I guess it's just like you hop in here and then continue. And if I go through the other door, it's not going to be a commentary anymore.
The first little part here makes you realize, oh, not only do I not always want to kill monsters.
Wait.
The first
How can I
little part. The first little part here makes.
Okay, wait. Check the stream. We are good.
The first little part here makes you realize, oh, not only do I not always want to kill monsters immediately, sometimes I want to save them, and I want to get them from one place to another because I need them in some other place to do something for me, you know, to let me jump off them there or pick up a key or something. And so that's really interesting. Of course, we got this whole platform dynamic.
So this part on the left-hand side was a later addition, right? And it came from wanting the level to have a little more meat to it and not just have this 1 or 2 puzzles, right? I felt very good about adding this part here. I'm pretty sure it was relatively late in the design of World 2. I wanted a way, you know, I was like looking for more ways to use monsters to do stuff, right? I liked the idea of having a puzzle piece at the beginning of the level with clearly there's nothing around to get it, right? All of the puzzles previously to this in World 2, you can sort of see what's near it that might be actionable, with the exception of the killed monster on the previous level, right? Here, you walk into the level and clearly there's nothing, right? And so now you start saying, well, what could I use, right? And a lot of the times people don't know and they just play through the level and maybe come back later. But if you're kind of intrepid in your approach to this and you're really looking, you're like, oh, there's a monster there. If you're not thinking about that monster with respect to that puzzle piece, then maybe it looks like more of an obstacle that you have to get by. It's like, I'm just trying to get from left to right on the level. I'm going to ride a platform, right? And oh, I have to dodge a monster. And oh, I got the timing good. So I got over the cannon before the cannon fired.
Right. And you think
now I'm smart.
That was the goal.
Yeah. And maybe you forget about the puzzle piece even, right? And so this is a thing that I've learned to do sometimes as a designer, although it also can be bad, which I'll get to in a second. But, you know, this platform and this lever seem like the
next thing for you to do.
They have an obvious use. The obvious use isn't really that interesting, but it's plausible, right? And especially if you're early in the game, you don't have super high...
I'm still learning to run and jump here.
Yeah, it's plausible, but really this is an important puzzle element because you need to use the platform to get the piece on the left. And if there weren't a plausible excuse for why you would use this, then it's obviously part of the solution to the puzzle, right? But here it's a little bit hidden in plain sight by the fact that, well, look, obviously it's a little bit of an action platformer thing to time it right and ride across to the rest of the level. And that's something that I like to do when I can do it. Now, the downside of that approach is that sometimes in the quest to make excuses for things to be there, you can add a little too much and a level can get a little heavy and contrived. And maybe that even happens sometimes in Braid. It's something that I got more of a sense for in The Witness and in the new game. Yeah, I felt good about myself as a designer when I made this puzzle. It's one of my happier memories from the game.
Looks so much like it doesn't seem to be that overly complicated as they make it to be.
Then in the next part of this, it gets really profound about the timing. At first, rewind is just a way to not die, right?
Yeah.
It's just, oh, good, you know, I don't have a limited number of lives. I get to try this again. But then you realize, oh my gosh, if I can do that, what else can I do? And in this level, there's this jump that it looks like, oh, geez, how am I ever going to get this? I have to time this perfectly. And then you realize, well, but with the help of rewind, I can do this fine control of my timing. I can adjust by a fraction of a second without having to just try to do that in my head. I can almost measure it with the help of rewind and make sure that I'm there at exactly the right time.
What I'm using is the fuse.
In the game, you're using
to measure
time as a resource to control your motions.
Originally, it was pretty hard to hit this kind of timing because there was no visual signal, right? So the cannons in the game, if you look at the cannon that's there now, right, there's a barrel piece and then there's a wooden mount piece with a little image of the monster on it so that if somehow time is stopped, or you could have levels where cannons shoot everything they're going to shoot and the monsters are somewhere else and you could look at it and remember. It probably doesn't help that much, but we thought it was a good idea to put in there. But then there's also the fuse, which is the most important thing here, right? Because the fuse helps you judge the timing, because you can say something like, you know, I'm going to jump when the fuse is at this point.
Right.
Oh, that was too early, right? So let me wait a little bit more.
So you have that visual cue.
Yeah. Now, the problem is, and it's not that big of a problem, right? But games are often not perfect, right? And here I always have to contend with the fact that I'm doing puzzles, but it's also a platformer. And, you know, if you're going to try the jump again, are you standing in the same place, right? Did you, if there's a little bit of acceleration on the run, did you jump super early or later, right? How far toward the ledge did you go? And all of these things also affect the jump.
Although
right?
the collision mechanics with the monsters is pretty forgiving, I think. I mean, you have a window there.
Yeah, but I mean, just, you know, even when I go back and play this level, it's not totally easy for me. Like it takes
Absolutely.
a few tries, right?
It takes a few tries.
Yeah.
But there's a kind of shift of perspective. I mean, of course, lots of gamers are very happy to take many, many tries on a boss level or whatever, or some complicated run. But the rewind sort of changes your perspective a little bit on that. Like now your multiple tries are, they're not failures. It feels more like this is how you play the game because you can go back in time, you can rewind, time can branch in various ways. And this is kind of the part of the game where we first start to get that.
Let's talk about these two pieces of level one at a time. This first one came later, and then the part with the falling and
What
the
the
timing
fuck?
was the original idea of the whole level. That was in the original prototype, I believe.
Wow.
But the reason the level's called Leap of Faith is that is a classic idea of platformer design that it's bad to do. Like specifically, if you're playing one of these traditional platformers where you die if you do the wrong thing, then you don't want to put the player in a situation where they have to jump down to somewhere where they can't see, and maybe if they jump in the wrong spot, they might die, because that's completely unfair, right?
Right.
You're asking them to do something that they can't do, and it just feels
and
bad,
use
right?
up a life on it, and whatever.
Yeah, it's once a game starts feeling unfair like that, you lose a certain kind of faith.
Yeah, but like with the time
So
adjustment, it doesn't really matter.
that's something that rewind changes, right? Like not only does dying not matter in the same way, like you have infinite lives, but also you could sort of, if you really want to be twitchy about it, you could kind of use this recon and like not fall all the way down and just rewind before you hit the bottom or whatever,
Exactly.
right? And so the setup of World 2 is that we're trying to find ways that without being able to change what would happen, right? How does rewind affect what you can do while you're playing, right? And so, like I said, rewind doesn't affect the laws of physics, but you sort of can get information from the future.
And an impatient player would see that jump you have to execute in the second part of this level and say, oh, forget it. I can't play this. There's no way I can play such a demanding game that's demanding so much of my timing. This is no fun. And then you're like, oh, actually, I'm much more in control than I thought I was. I think there's a lot of points in the game where you're like, if only I could do, oh, wait, I can.
There is no door to continue to the next commentary. Shit. Oh. Okay, maybe I'm doing it wrong, but I don't know. So this was the third one. Okay. Whoop. What's the simplest thing to design using the bare fact of objects that don't rewind?
I mean, this is so awesome because now we're coupling like time and space. So now we're really starting to use the rewind to control the relative position of these clouds, which, and change them from something we can't jump over to something we can. And that's really interesting, and it's really fun to play with the fact that half the clouds rewind, the other half don't. And of course, this gets deeper farther on in the game.
Of course, that, again, we start out designing one of these worlds, and the question is, again, what can you do? And I was in the mindset of what's the most minimal thing that I can do given this feature, technical or gameplay feature, that some things don't rewind, right? In the very original prototype of the game, it wasn't quite like this. It
so
wasn't
hilarious.
a property of objects. It was just like, there was just the magic key, right? And the magic key wouldn't rewind, right?
Right.
And then
Why not other things?
yeah, well, I realized later, like the way we do the magic key is by excluding it from the rewind loop. So like, let's just have that be a property that could or might not be attached to any particular thing, right? So I was thinking, what's the most minimal thing you can do, and came up with this, and I like it, right? As always, when trying to balance, platformer with puzzle, it's a little bit harder than I wish it was in some ways, in the following way. So I said before, sometimes people miss jumps and they don't realize yet that they can rewind because they're not used to a game that has rewind, right?
Mm-hmm.
By the time people get here, probably they have used rewind a bunch and they remember it more. And the problem here is that you very carefully set this thing up, right? And by now, people might be rewinding. And when they rewind, they mess up. And if they rewind to a point when they were over one of the non-rewindable clouds, they'll fall earlier. It's like it becomes a little more frustrating even than it should be, right? So of course, the right thing to do is be patient and line them up again. But if you do that too soon, you'll fly back up into the air, right? So you want to stand on the ground for a little bit, right? Hold on, rewind the right amount, get them in phase, and then not miss the jump, right? And of course, you can do things that are messier than that. That's like a very deliberate way to solve it. You can do things that are messier, but they're more frustrating, right? So,
But I also like this element of it because now that there are objects in the world that don't rewind, it means that it might be a little tricky to recover the state you wanted. It means that, rewind is not just an undo. It's going to change some aspects of the world and not change others, and it's going to be a little complicated. And you start to sense that rewind is going to be this very dynamic element in your strategy.
Oh, okay, so this door just puts me in the same level, but to the next commentary. Okay.
I like this one because at first you're like, okay, so I know how to do this because I just saw the previous puzzle, but oh wait, that's just too far. And one thing I did this thing that I call wiggle time, where you like repeatedly tap the backspace button a little bit until things are in just the right place. And
I see.
But yeah.
And now that's, again, something easy to mess up because if you rewind too far, now you're in the air again, right? So
That's true.
you have to be a little bit patient and like tap, but it works.
Yeah, I guess I didn't mind that.
Yeah.
So
When I design a puzzle like this, I'm thinking about how it's perceived, because that's part of what I'm trying to make in a game like this is not just the puzzle, right? But the experience of seeing the puzzle and what do you think when you see the puzzle, right? And in this one, it's pretty clearly just like the one you just did, longer distance and, sort of bigger gap. Like, I just like the thought process of like, oh, it looks like I do the same thing, but I can't really do the same thing. And the way that I think about the difference between these two, which may or may not be the way any player ever does, right? But the difference is this one on the left is solvable statically. Like you can rewind.
there's one move.
Yeah,
Yeah.
You rewind till the things are in the right spacing and then you go, right?
Right.
And then if you don't mess up when you go, you get the puzzle piece, right? On the right-hand side, that is not the case, right?
And you have to use rewind more dynamically.
Yeah, in the middle of progress across the gap, you must use rewind in some way, and that's
Right,
the difference
right.
between them.
Yeah, so it's sort of building up the virtuosity of the player in how they use rewind as a tool. There's also, there's a design element here which shows up later on, which is this long shelf above all this, which makes one kind of curious, like, why is that there? Because
Why is the
almost
flower
everything
here?
in the game is there for a reason, and is this,
Tell
what's
me.
going on?
Seems very extraneous.
And maybe this time around it is, but later it isn't, and that's kind of nice.
So I think it's just because it's in the other puzzle where you need to put a ring to slow yourself down. And so they added it here, so it's like matching.
So let's see. Is this Ground Beneath Her Feet?
Named after a novel by Salman Rushdie. by the
Oh,
way.
I don't know that one.
Yeah. I just really enjoyed it when I read it. And sometimes, okay, here's, it's a very amateur thing to do. Like when you're making something to put like, oh, my favorite band has a song and let me put a poster from them in my game or whatever, right? But sometimes I do that a little bit. It's okay. I do. Yeah, it happens a few times in this game, and yeah,
Yeah, like Mario
I mean,
it's
theme.
fine.
Like I teach a subject, computer science, that people think is just a totally recent invention, and it has these very deep historical and intellectual roots, and I like pointing those out to people, that it goes deeper than they think. So I think it's really good to connect things to some other cultural works, older cultural works. I think it reminds you that this is part of a larger intellectual whole. I know not everybody's into that,
but it's also, so the reason it feels like an amateur thing to me is because when you don't have that many of your own ideas, it feels like ideas, right? Like, oh, especially for like, because being, I don't know how much I subscribe to some of these social lines that get drawn, but being a member of Generation X and like pop culture references being a thing, it's just one of those. And I don't know. I feel weird about it, but it's fine.
the part that I really like about this is on the screen to the right.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where we do this amazing thing of briefly standing on a platform that isn't there because it was there before, and oh my gosh, what's going on, and what does rewind really mean? Because there's a lot of places later in the game where you have to think quite hard about what it means to go backwards and what you'll still be able to do there, and to what extent the past and the present will interact and in what ways.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. So, the reason this level is the way it is in terms of putting these two puzzles together is because there's like a juxtaposition between them in a way. Like I wanted to think of them as duals of each other in some way, and I'm not sure that they are. I think that may be two...
the two halves of this puzzle?
Well, in this one on the left, it's perhaps more obvious in some ways, right? As long as you remember that the monster was there and don't run around the level and forget that he was there, right? But then next time if you go off, play the rest of the game, you come back, you see him, and then you're like, oh, right? It's not that hard to come up with the idea, I need to keep the monster alive, right? And then you sort of, you push the platform out of where you need it and then into where you need it. But it's not that hard of a puzzle, right?
Yeah, because at first
you're standing on the physicality of the platform, and so is the monster. How's that?
Yeah, and at first you think, oh, if I move it over there, then how do I get it back over there? And it's not rewindable, and
yeah. But then I somehow, where do ideas come from? But I had the idea to do something like the opposite, right? Like, how do I make it so that you have to like not be standing on the platform, right? So, and then that's why these two are juxtaposed in the same place, because each puzzle is one platform, one lever. And then in one, it's like you're standing on it, and then the other one, you stand on it to set it up, but you remove it, right? And that's what lets you get there.
Yeah, and I think this puzzle is, the second half of this puzzle is one where I was stuck for a little bit, and I was like, wait, this is impossible. Either the platform is there, and I can't get down through it, or it isn't there, and I will fall down. Again, it's one of these nice moments where it's like you think something is impossible, and that paradox, like, in the grand paradoxes of quantum mechanics, there's this saying of, oh, we have a paradox, finally we can make some progress. Yeah. And so these moments where like, come on, this is impossible, but okay, I guess it must be possible somehow because I bought this game, and this is not the last level in the game, but then that forces you to learn something new about the mechanics.
It's kind of like with the stars, and then you kind of need a clue that they exist, or you can solve something to get the stars. But if you don't have that information, you won't be able to even start solving. Wait. Where's the door? Damn it. Wait a second. Do I need to solve this? I think it's beginning. You have to solve puzzles to get to new commentary? Alright. Well, I did expect that. Was there something? Was there a Joe yet? There was a Joe. Wait, what? Okay, it starts here. Wait, I saw it. I swear, so... There's nothing else. There's no way to get there. Or is it just trying to tell me to go check other commentaries? Yeah, I don't see how this could be possible. I either need to jump on this platform somehow, or manipulate time in a way where the cannon doesn't shoot as much. But I don't even see that cannon. It does seem to be affected by time, so... Casey Moratori. I have no idea who the Chris Moore is. Did they ever
It's
say?
April 2022.
I think it's hair professor doctor,
You
actually.
do have hair with Dr. Chris Moore of the Santa Fe Institute, or how would you?
I
like
guess
people
on
to know?
Hair doctor professor,
computer
of
science?
course. So I think it's
Completely about it, and they share with it's April 2022, and I. These are excerpts from an interview by Casey Muratori, who I first met back in the 1990s, and who was one of the early playtesters of Braid. And, as you'll hear in the interview, Casey was responsible for a substantial portion of the original ideas that inspired this game.
I hope they'll get into like the meaning of Braid a bit. But like the creators usually love to obscure that or leave it to interpretations. So. I would rather hear their explanation. What they thought they made. What kind of options they left for interpretation there. And what they didn't do. I feel like the truth is more interesting.
I guess I don't really know, but I know you've said that you got the idea for Braid in late 2004.
Yeah, well, it
And-
was your idea, actually.
And I've always been a little confused by that, but I mean, I guess I sort of know what you mean. But so why don't you walk us through exactly what that means? Because obviously there's the email that I wrote that I think you're referring to.
Yeah.
But I think there's a deeper through line there because that part is just one piece of it. There's the whole thing with like invisible cities and there's all these other lineages that are like involved there and I don't really know in what order these start gelling together. It's obviously not just like, oh, there's this one email and everything happened after the email. There was like a bunch of things I feel like, so.
Yes. There are many factors that it's hard to place, but before the email, sort of the background that was percolating was Invisible Cities was one of my favorite books, and there were other works at the time that were obviously influenced by that, right? And one of these was a book called Einstein's Dreams by someone who is a physicist in his day job, Alan Lightman, right? And so both of these books take the form of a bunch of little vignettes that are 3 or 4 pages each that explore some different idea that is a little bit absurdist or somehow obviously not the case, right?
Okay.
Like not literal explorations and not
Right.
logical explorations. So in Invisible Cities, you know, there are cities where I'm not going to remember any of them well enough to like do justice, but you know, there's a city where every point above, it's like on the water, right? Like Venice. And every point of the city above the water has a corresponding point below.
Okay.
But it's also conflated with the reflection in the water. And like people are spying on each other and there are no secrets because from every point of the city, you can see every other point by looking in the reflection. I'm completely butchering it, but it's things like that. It's things that like don't exactly map to reality 100%. Right. The one that my company is named after, which of course I remember the best, is about, it's a city built by just looking up at the stars and seeing what the structure and the architecture is, and like, okay, let's copy that down here. And it always seems to be perpetually under construction and never completed. Right?
Oh, wow. Okay.
Which is maybe a little bit of a bad omen when you...
That's great.
Yeah.
But appropriate for game development.
Sadly.
Life cycle, yeah.
Sadly. And then Einstein's Dreams was like that, but different. It was, you know, many people know the story that Albert Einstein was a lowly, not particularly respected patent clerk before he did all his good stuff. And Einstein's Dreams is about him going home every day after the office and doing his physics at home and like just falling asleep, thinking about what is the answer to how it could be that light behaves. Right. On the one hand, this is like, maybe there are different topologies to the universe. If there's a fourth dimension, what is it and how it behaves?
Yeah.
But it's also used it's like transposed onto, let's say, the idea dimension of like what people are and how they behave and like how their relationships go and stuff. Right. And so in a certain kind of universe, maybe light goes kind of slow and that makes everything cold and people are cold to each other or something. Again, I'm butchering it.
Okay.
But like, that's the basic idea. And
so it's sort of like a very like microcosmic thing where all the different parts are exhibiting the same sorts of change. So we make one change, but we kind of pretend that change ripples through everything, even if it wouldn't necessarily make quite logical physical sense that was true.
Yeah, sometimes it varies a little bit. What I would say is that there's a constant use of laws of physics in an analogical way, like to make analogies with like ways that behavior could be. And sometimes that's more literal and sometimes it's less literal.
I see.
Now that even, it's very clear to me now, and maybe it even was then, but that actually owes a lot to another set of Calvino stories called the Cosmic Comics stories. Which is very explicitly about that too. It's like, so one of the early Cosmic Comics stories is like, there's a guy who's just like rotating in space around, like he's in a certain part of the galaxy and his life is just many rotations of the galaxy. And he's very alone. And once in a while he passes maybe a mark that somebody else made and he wonders like, what is this and who made it and where did it come from and that kind of a thing. Or another one is, it's at many different scales. So another one of the stories is, you could imagine the moon being much closer to the Earth and with a more eccentric orbit, such that sometimes it comes a lot closer and sometimes it's further. And gravity's a little bit different, so that like maybe the ground kind of melts up like cheese a little bit. And on there's like an expedition where it comes so close at a certain time that like we're gonna cross and we're gonna go to the moon by like throwing ropes up there and like climbing up there, right? It's that kind of story, and they're very entertaining, and I recommend them to anyone who's interested because they're all very readable, because the stories are often very short and they have an enjoyable idea that they get to very quickly. But all of this, you know, I had read as much Calvino as I could get my hands on. And all of that was influential on what Braid was, although don't blame him if you don't like the text in the game, because it's very different from anything he would have written, right? Part of what I was consciously doing is like not copying, right? Like, let's make this its own thing, even though it's heavily influenced. But so all that was flying around sort of in my mind at some point. Like, I wanted to do a game version of what I liked about these stories, right?
Okay. Still not sure how it correlates to the Braid exactly. But I also haven't read those books, so maybe it would be more clear if I did. I mean, in the Braid, the extra thing that adds on is the time, I guess. The time manipulation.
I had an idea of an experience that I wanted the player to have at the start of the game.
Okay.
Just an art thing. Like, wouldn't it be nice if the following, right? And you see yourself silhouetted and you have this like simple moment. And that includes all sorts of even pragmatic things, like the game not booting to a menu and just booting to this scene that almost could act like a screensaver until you start playing the game.
And there's not like 50 logos that come up.
Zero logos,
cetera, right?
Yeah. You know, the first thing a lot of people want to do is put their company logo that nobody's ever heard of or cares about, and that's the first thing you see. And I'm like, no. And in fact, Witness was the same way. It boots, and then you're in the hallway.
Yep.
Yeah. The other thing, and it's related, but
that I kind of respect,
is because my agenda was for this to be an art game, and not just to be an art game, but to show other designers and players, like, this is a way that games can be that games usually aren't being, right? So it was to make a point, kind of like the game starts up, you see a thing, it's not like Mario.
Right.
You're like, what exactly is going on?
Yeah.
And it's a statement. This experience you're about to have is different from the ones that you are used to. Like, I wanted to hit people with that right away, but in a way that was also beautiful and nice.
Okay.
So that was a very early idea.
Okay.
Like, those initial builds of the game that I sent to you guys didn't have this. It was just like you're in level 1 or whatever.
But you had wanted it at that time.
Well, I don't know, but relatively soon after, once I started thinking about how do I put all this together, like that came in there.
Well, it didn't hit me the way it's supposed to be intended, but there were games that also started right away, but I can't quite remember. Yeah, there's not much with this sort of thing. I kind of got used to it a bit more. But also, like, Braid came out way back. 2006, was it?
So the house, well, I'd had this idea that if it's a puzzle game, I think the idea that you would be able to trivially run through the levels came much later. But before that, it was like, okay, these levels are going to have puzzles. I had done enough looking at games to see that if you have a very linear structure and you have puzzles, people get stuck on a puzzle and then they can progress no further in the game.
Right.
And that's terrible. They get mad at the game. There's plenty of enjoyable times that they would be able to have that you're not letting them have.
Yep.
And you're not even giving them that much of a chance to figure out the puzzle, because banging your head against one thing is not that great, even for just processes of thought, right?
Right.
If what helps you solve the puzzle is better facility with the universe of this game and how the rules work and all that, then, like, if I just give you more experience with the game in different contexts, then you're better armed to come back and solve whatever you were stuck on. So all of this led me to think, okay, we want a structure where if there are a bunch of worlds with different physics in them, like, we probably should introduce them roughly in some sequence, but who's to say you have to solve them in sequence or even play them in sequence, right? And so it's deliberately different from a book that way. Although, again, books like Dictionary of the Khazars are deliberately nonlinear, but it's very rare in a book to do that.
Right, most books are linear.
Yeah, like Choose Your Own Adventure is deliberately nonlinear.
Right, yeah.
But this was a way of trying to make the puzzle game good. Okay, so if it's kind of nonlinear and you can go to things in whatever order, how do you know when you're done? How do you get to the end? I can't just put the end after World 6 or whatever, because what if you haven't finished the other ones?
Right.
So there's got to be something gating you from the ending.
Right.
And it would be nice if that was something where you could see your progress incrementally. Like you could imagine there's just some door that's locked until everything else is done and then it opens. And that is functionally what is there. But I came up with this thing where, like, you know, the different ladders are there based on what worlds you finished, and you can climb higher, although you can't really get to anything. So that feels a little bit better. And if you've solved them discontinuously, there'll be a gap where you can't climb, but then you see the other ladder out there and you get this feeling of progress. You get the visual feedback of progress. And there's this mystery of like what's in that attic. Right. And you get the whole game to think about that because you see the attic at the beginning. And I mean, if you poke around, and at some point, probably long before the end, because you end up coming back to this house between every world. And every time you quit the game and restart it, you're back in the house. And so you probably poked around at some point and you're like, oh, what's up there? And I never put a sign saying you're trying to get into the attic, right? But it's natural to want to know. And so that all seemed like a good way to structure it.
This guy Casey, I don't know why he's even here. He's not contributing much.
You know, you kind of want to flesh it out and figure out the structure of the game, and if these are puzzles made out of puzzle pieces like they were at the time, you need to have enough to make a puzzle in each world. And even if that weren't the constraint, it's still awkward maybe at a game of that size to have some areas with a lot of puzzles and some with a few. Although, again, with The Witness, I made the opposite decision, but that works better because of the structure of that game being bigger and like there was a decision.
What do you mean by the opposite decision?
Yeah,
well,
I also
in Braid,
didn't get
it's
that.
very regular, right? There are 12 puzzle pieces in each world, right? And so if a world doesn't have 12 puzzle pieces, maybe I'm not done designing it.
I see.
And there are, because of the structure of that game, is with a lot of puzzles and some with a few. Although, again, with The Witness, I made the opposite decision, but that works better because of the structure of that game being big, right? And there was a decision.
What do you mean by the opposite decision?
Well, in Braid, it's very regular, right? There are 12 puzzle pieces in each world, right? And so if a world doesn't have 12 puzzle pieces, maybe I'm not done designing it.
I see.
And in The Witness, it was more like, going into it, I see that the design space is going to be more irregular than that. So I'm simply going to avoid any structure of that kind.
Because basically you'd have to cut too many puzzles or add too many puzzles to some of the sections. If you tried to pick like the median number or something and have everything hit that, it just wasn't going to work.
Right. Even in Braid, there's probably a little bit of that. Like there are probably, if I thought harder on some worlds, there are really good puzzles that could be there, but I was done thinking about it because there were 12.
Gotcha.
Right? Yeah.
Okay.
And then the worst thing than that actually is I don't have 12, and so I need to start to make filler, right? And that's sort of why the number is 12. It's because that was the degree to which I found that I didn't really need filler to have enough.
So maybe some world in Braid would really have liked to have been 13 or 14, but it was just better to go, okay, the world where I have the least ideas for puzzles, they hit about 12, so we're just going to call it 12, and because I want it to be regular.
Yeah, and you know, I probably made the decision for 12 provisionally before I had that verification.
I see.
But it was a guess that turned out to be okay.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Just so we're clear on what a reward is, though, because somebody who is not necessarily familiar with exactly what's going on in all of these types of designs is the fact that in Braid, I put together this puzzle and then the ladder to the attic goes over, right? Like, why isn't that a reward? Or so can you be a little bit more specific just for anyone who was unclear on what those two things were? What to you differentiates this sort of thing into two categories where one is a reward and the other is actually just part of the game design?
Well, we can again, we can turn a dial here.
Okay.
And so the thing that you're talking about with the ladders, it is technically a reward. It's a muted one, right? It's an acknowledgement of progress where you expect the feeling of satisfaction comes internally from the player, right? Like, oh, I see that I made this progress that probably I had planned out. Like the first one, you don't really know what's going on, but after one or two, you're like, okay, I want the third one now.
Right.
And then you see that you got the third one now, and you're like, okay, this is good. And you decide that it's good, right?
Yeah.
Now, you can turn a dial about how extrinsic it is. So the one that's there right now is almost completely intrinsic in that we're not taking very many steps to get you hyped, right?
I want to say the camera doesn't even really pan to it or anything.
No, it
right?
doesn't. You just
kind of
climb up there
happens.
and you see it.
Yeah.
I'm not a big fan of camera pans. I
Yeah.
almost never do them.
Yeah.
It takes extra programming. Whereas, interestingly, so that game company, which is a different game company, they're very concerned with having people feel specific emotions, and they do camera pans all the time.
Okay.
So that's an interesting difference that you could think about. So what else could I do? Well, I could. So when you get a ladder in place is when you put the last puzzle piece in and put the puzzle in the frame, right? I could do a camera pan at that time. That's a little more, it's still utilitarian because it's like, I want to just make sure that you notice this thing, but it's also making a bigger deal out of it, right? Well, instead of a camera pan, you could do a camera pan with like a cool sound effect and like, maybe it materializes in place, right?
Yeah.
And that's cooler. You're making a bigger moment out of it.
You play Flight of the Valkyries.
Well, again, you can keep going. Like instead of it materializing, maybe it materializes with like gold stars that shoot off like fireworks or whatever. Maybe the little dinosaur guy and his friends have a little parade around your character and then walk up to the thing, right? And they're like tooting on the horns and stuff.
Or Bloopy.
Yes.
Bloopy could come out.
Bloopy could come out and say, congratulations,
The hell is
that
Bloopy?
the fourth ladder, which is even better than the third ladder. You're way better at this game than you've ever been before. And there's only 2 ladders left. And I'm sure it's going to be so amazing when you get that last ladder, right? This is more and more extrinsic. And there are multiple dimensions to it. Like there's, shooting off the fireworks and making a big deal out of it. But there's also like rhetoric, like, you're so strong because you beat that boss.
Yeah.
You're such a smart person for figuring out that puzzle. And games do all of these things.
Yes.
Right? And, well,
how do you pause the commentary? I don't want to like talk over it.
Yeah.
Right.
But like this is like exactly what happened in Baldur's Gate, that they put too much attention to like making sure certain characters say things like, "Oh, you're so such a nice person," like the thing with Shadowheart and her like constant line where you can just press and check like your relationship with her, I guess. That's just like
that is
annoying.
Making a big deal out of it, but there's also like rhetoric, like, well, if you look at the games on the phone, they're one certain way.
Yeah.
Right. And they're that way for a reason. And this is a little bit of an interesting thing then, because
this is how
this is a little bit of an interesting thing then, because it's really not possible to dial the extrinsic part all the way to 0. Like there's always trace amounts of it. Even
because you didn't have to prevent the person from going into the attic. They could have just gone to the attic at the beginning of the game. So the fact that you chose to prevent them from going to the attic makes getting to the attic a reward by definition.
Well, but also I made it bigger than it had to be. So for example, I put these ladder segments, we worked to make them look a little bit good. Like they're in a sequence that you can understand and that's supposed to create drama toward the ending. It could instead be there's a ladder that goes all the way. I mean, we could just let you in, right? But even before that, you could climb up and you walk in front of the door and it says locked :
Right, 2
3
out of 6
out of 6 puzzles.
Right.
And that's way less extrinsically motivating even than what we're already doing. It's also just less classy and it makes the game less nice and all these things. And so that's my point, is that these things are correlated and it's really, really hard to get them even anywhere near 0 and still have a good game.
All right. Yeah, that's an interesting point. Yeah, I really like this game design philosophy that he's doing. I don't know if it works for like all the people, but for me, just as close to a perfect like principles in game design that you should follow.
Why is it like a 2D platformer from like, because there are many things you could have done. You could have done something more like a top-down sort of thing, or you could have decided it should have been in 3D, or you could have. So there was something that made you pick that. Was that just, hey, a random first guess and then it stuck, or were you like, there's a reason?
There are 2 reasons, 2 lines of reasoning that came together. One was, hey, when I first went into games industry, didn't even feel like the industry at the time, but doing this bolt action stuff, we did some really hard, challenging thing, and we only had 2 programmers. Like, imagine anyone in the year 2022 saying, I've got a 2-person programming team. We're going to build our own game engine that doesn't even use the graphics API, and it's going to be drop in, drop out, client server, narrow bandwidth action game, and we're going to make it in like a year or 2 years. It's like nobody these days would even try that, and like we somehow did it without even being in games.
Right. Okay. So I get getting 3D out of the mix, but now there are many different types of 2D games. There's top down, there's isometric, there's
let me go back to that for a second, right? Because so like I said, I'd had a hard time firstly with bolt action, but we made a game. We made several iterations of it. It shipped to people.
Yes.
It was grueling, but we did it. And we were poor all the time and all that. After that, like I said, I was kind of burned out. I worked on other projects like Gallstaff, and there was probably other 3D stuff before Gallstaff. And like everything I did was trying to be 3D in some way. The air guitar game was trying to parse 3D space, right?
Yes.
Like that's even harder.
Yeah.
I definitely noticed the pattern. And so Happy Cake, for example, as we discussed, was completed.
Also
and
3D.
3D. It was a lot of work. We got it done, but also the delta between that and a game that I would have liked was like still pretty big, right? And so I had a good taste for how hard 3D was. I knew that I could do it, but I also knew that it was going to take a lot of time and energy to do it, both technically, firstly, but also in terms of design. Just getting things to feel good in 3D is harder.
Yeah.
Solving issues like, oh, there's just visibility problems here, or collision doesn't feel good, or whatever it is. Those are all easier just from a design standpoint in 2D than 3D.
I see.
Right? And so what I was saying to myself was, I would have envisioned that I would have done a big, groundbreaking, meaningful game. I was about to say important, but I don't know what important means. And I don't think I would have said it that way. But like, I wanted to really make my contribution to games, and I hadn't made a game that was like that yet.
Okay.
Right. So Happy Cake didn't ship to anybody. The bolt action game was played by a 3 or 4 digit number of people.
Right.
And then didn't continue after that.
Right.
So it's like, when am I going to do this thing? And what do I do to maximize the probability that this time this project succeeds, right? And there were many things. I was like, it's time to get serious and stop playing around on all these little projects. Now, we've talked through a lot of the consulting that I did. We talked through a few of the projects that I did, but like there were a lot of little projects. And when we skimmed over like game developer magazine, right? I
Right.
did that for like 3 or 4 years.
Yeah, yeah.
It's like 20 to 30 little projects.
Yeah, yeah.
That whole thing.
Yeah.
It was nuts.
Yeah.
So I was like, okay, let's stop messing around and make a game that's really good. So firstly, eliminate technical challenge and design challenge by being 2D.
Well, he didn't answer the question why the platformer and not something else.
Okay, what kind of 2D? There's lots of 2D games.
This is sort of the bullseye of the question, which is I wasn't quite sure how you ended up with.
Well, I already
Platformer.
knew, like, okay, we're going to screw around with time,
Okay.
right? At least. And maybe we're going to do this other quantum stuff. It's unclear. But what is the form of it? Well, we know from the Calvino influence, it's about going between different worlds,
Mm-hmm.
and the rules change in every world.
Right.
And that's what's cool
Oh,
about
that
it. Like,
that
maybe in this world there's superposition,
how it
right?
Right.
Maybe in this world there's time goes backwards, whatever.
Right.
How it
But it's
goes.
interesting that part of the entertainment value or the knowledge you take from the game is
Right.
seeing and understanding those changes, right? How do you do that? Well, somehow you're comparing them with the baseline. If you don't have the ability to compare them, like, hey, we've
Right.
got this cool superposition thing. How do you understand why the superposition is interesting and how it's cool and how it affects things? Well, you know how the things would have been without the superposition, and then you add the superposition, right? And so I was thinking, hey, the value in this game is supposed to come from the cool reality bendy stuff. If the rules of the game are really complicated, and then you apply some reality bendy stuff, you might not even know, like, how some interaction would have resulted in the vanilla one
Right.
if it's complicated, and then you're going to be uncertain and unclear, and then especially if it's a puzzle game, which I was pretty sure it was going to be,
Okay.
if it's unclear what is the local reality weirdness effect and what is the base rule set, that's a level of uncertainty that you don't want on the ground level when, like, trying to solve puzzles, right? That's going to
Right.
mess up the puzzle solving. And so
Right.
I knew all this without having designed the game at all, which just, I think, tells you that I'd been thinking about this kind of thing for years in the EGW and elsewhere, right?
Right. Okay.
So, what are the simple kinds of games? I just thought through them, and a Mario game came to mind very quickly, right? Whereas some games in that genre have like a lot of creatures and a lot of characters with different abilities and all this stuff.
Right.
Very clearly, the prototypical Mario game is there's one monster that just goes in a straight line and you could jump on his head.
Right.
Like, that's the minimum for
Right.
that genre.
Right.
And then you could dial that up. Like, you could add more monsters if you want them, if you need more
Right.
complexity. And so
Right.
I could figure out later what is the weird stuff and then gauge based on that how much more can the game sustain.
Right.
And I knew all this before literally typing any code.
Okay.
Yeah.
So basically, the selection of Mario was largely driven by wanting the simplest possible, visually understandable mechanic that people would just go, okay, the baseline one is obvious to me, so that when it starts getting modified, they're not like, what the heck happened? They could clearly see, like, oh, right, it's this.
Yeah.
Okay.
And now you can think about some other games that are simple, like Asteroids is simple. you
Right.
know, Robotron is simple. And
Yeah.
it just, thinking through those, it's like, well, so the Mario game has this element of, like, it's a guy, right?
Yeah.
And that brings it to a human scale. Like, the Mario games, Mario's a character. And
Right.
that's a little bit like the humanity in the stories that I wanted to, like, I wanted to
Yeah.
bridge to that. If you have like a little arrow-sized spaceship, you're not getting that, right?
Right.
So
Was that a concrete thought you had when evaluating these?
yeah, I mean, I'm sure I thought through
Okay.
a bunch of them. And in fact, this was probably the genesis of the idea that there were going to be a bunch of retro games in Braid as well, of
Right,
other
which we'll
genres.
have to talk about since that did not actually happen.
That did not actually happen.
We should talk about those.
Yeah.
Wait, what? Huh? Uh-oh. Getting lost.
You know, you kind of want to flesh it out and figure out the structure of the game, and if these are puzzles made out of puzzle pieces like they were at the time, you need to have enough to make a puzzle in each world.
Did I listen
and
to
even if that weren't the constraint, it's still awkward maybe at a game of that size to have some game being worlds, right?
Okay.
And so if a world doesn't have 12 puzzle pieces, maybe I'm not done designing it.
I see.
Rewind was the way that I mapped bi-directional arrow of time into a concrete feature that I could type, right? So let's type the feature in, let's make it work. And it wasn't that hard, you know, given what I had, right? I don't remember exactly how long it took, but way less than the week. Right. So then I had that and I was playing around with it. And, you know, there like isn't that much you can do with that aside from, isn't it cool?
That's why I was interested in how'd you get over this initial hump, right? Like,
well, there's a simple answer to that. But before that, you know, right away I was thinking about this problem of like, okay, it's interesting in the way that had been discussed on the mailing list. But you could, you know, the initial implementation of just rewind, like you can imagine what that would be if I said Mario with rewind. It's like, all right, cool. Now, there's a fundamental shift, though, that already was in place before I even decided the rewind, which is that it's not that it's a game with technical features. It's that it's a game about how those features change the gameplay. Like that was part of the Calvino-Lightman ethic that I had going in. And so the initial problem is like, okay, I have this technical feature. I have implemented it. It is rewind.
Yes.
How can the game be about rewind?
Right.
And right away I start asking questions, and you can come up with some stuff like, well, it could be a lot harder than it could be without rewind. And you know,
you could just make it so that you're basically doing a tool-assisted speed run, as we would call it today.
Yes. That might not be very fun, but it is evident that things that are unfair without rewind become more fair with rewind, right?
Yes.
What else can you do? You could go forward into somewhere very dangerous that you would regret going and get information that you wouldn't have earlier in the game. Right. And then I was like, oh yeah, well, there is this game design wisdom that people have about how to design games, especially around platformers. And there's this term called leap of faith, which is taught to game designers, at least around the GDC when I was hanging out. I don't know what kids learn in school these days, but like it was a known, I didn't even ever make a platformer, but I knew leap of faith is bad because you're expecting the character to jump into somewhere that they don't know. And if they die, if there's somewhere that they die down there and somewhere that they don't, you can't. Rewind was the way that I wasn't that hard. You know, ethic. About it. Things that are unfair without
so that
becoming platformers. And there's there's somewhere streams of that. It's like maybe you die. Leap of faith is bad because you're expecting the character to jump into somewhere that they don't know. And if they die, if there's somewhere that they die down there and somewhere that they don't, you can't expect them to know in advance. It's completely unfair. So don't make your level that way. And well, there are extremes of that. It's like maybe you die at 100% of the places. And it's like, well, how would they know that either? Maybe it's safe at 100% of the places. It's like, well, that's probably better, but like it's still not good because you're forcing them to do something that they don't know is a good move. And if there's any other pits that go off screen anywhere else in the game, you're now still again creating an unfair and uncertain situation. And so, well, that's not true if you have rewind. Like free rewind. And that was one of the theses in the beginning. Like I said in the Moriarty talk, he was like, it should be totally free. And you were like, it should just be a feature of the system. And it's like, okay. If you were hanging around in the early 2000s at conferences with game designers, you'd hear that it's well understood. All good designers know that you just shouldn't have a leap of faith in your platformer game. That is, Suppose there's a pit that extends off the bottom
Yeah,
of the screen,
why is it?
and you're expected to jump down into that pit.
It's the
If there's
third
a
time
hazard
we're
you might
talking
land
about it.
on, you should be able to see the danger in advance so you have a fair chance to avoid it. A leap of faith is when
Bit
you can't
repetitive,
see
I would
what
say.
you're jumping into. Forcing the player to jump blindly, where some choices of where to jump would be deadly, is fundamentally unfair, and it makes the game feel bad. If this seems obvious to you today, know that enough early games did this that designers felt like it was a problem worth talking about. Also, this problem can manifest in a more indirect way. Imagine a game where you're playing a level and you definitely will die if you fall off the bottom of the screen, as you know from experience. But then in the same game in a later level, there's only one way forward, and that way requires you to go off the bottom of the screen and you can't see what's down there. This feels bad because the game is inconsistent. The player becomes less sure what the rules are, and you're asking him to suspend his defensive reflexes, but the point of the game so far was to hone those reflexes. And it makes the game feel arbitrary. Why do you not have to worry about dying here? Because the designer just said so. Why? Well, because. Now going forward, in every new place the player goes, in the back of his mind there's always going to be uncertainty. Do I die falling this time or not? Maybe there's a secret I can find. This degrades the quality of the play experience, especially if there's no secret and the player dies over and over and over. So now it's 2004 and I'm designing a game around rewind, and all this reasoning changes because there aren't limited lives and the cost of death is very low. So here a leap of faith is not so bad because it costs the player very little. The name of the level, by referencing this fact specifically, becomes, along with the design it's referring to, rhetoric about game design. So with this level name, the game goes slightly meta, though most non-designers won't recognize that. To them, though, leap of faith at least suggests, hey, there's going to be a big jump in this level. And there is. All that said, I think this pit is one of the rougher spots in the game. It's clumsy for most players to get to the bottom, and there's no clear takeaway from it. If I were to redesign Braid today, I would probably make objects fall at a slower speed so that free-fall situations are easier to deal with. After all, the point of the game is to show interesting rewind phenomena, not to test your reflexes. I would also consider discretizing Leap of Faith, as you can see by following this link here. In this particular pit, there are only a couple of obstacles, and they're positioned in weird places. I would like something cleaner, or even something where you have more air control and can navigate in this particular obstacles more effectively. At the time, I struggled with tweaking the parameters to make this level nicer to play, but parameters that work here seem bad for the rest of the game. We discussed some reasons for this over here, and some more over here.
What are those? So these icons, the puzzle pieces, and then books, they are different types. I think it's either like game design or programming. Yeah, sure.
Here, I have completely redesigned the Leap of Faith idea to communicate more clearly and to be a little funny, instead of clumsy and frustrating like the original one. There are these discrete pits that extend downward and you can't see down most of them, so you jump into the pits and you hope one of them's right. This makes more explicit the idea that you're using Rewind to gather information without suffering a penalty, which serves better the agenda of World 2, which is to illustrate how Rewind changes gameplay. The other two puzzle pieces from the original level don't fit into this design, so I haven't attempted to keep them. If you wanted to refit the game to actually use this revised level, you'd have to come up with a place to put those other puzzle pieces.
Hey. Are there any secrets here? Alright, well, it illustrates the idea better, I guess, but I don't know, just a bit more time-consuming. I think I still like the original better.
You said that in this game, the jumps are much shorter than Mario jumps.
Yes.
And that is not an accident, apparently. So why is this the case?
Lots of reasons. So it's over-determined, as we say, which means that even if you got rid of some of these, it would still be correct for the rest of them.
Okay, so you really, really in Braid, for many reasons, want these jumps to be
I will
short.
start listing reasons.
Okay. As part of the framing, could you also say, how did this come about? Like, did you just throw in a value at first and then it got refined over time, or like is there any also like procedural aspect?
Yeah.
You just not really remember?
Well, so to lay down the ideas,
Yeah.
there's this initial fundamental question,
Yeah.
which is, how does jumping even work mechanically?
Yeah.
Do you press the button and just a jump goes,
Right.
or do you hold the button and you like jump higher
Right.
as long as you hold it, which is how Super Mario Brothers works,
Right.
and
Right.
was considered to be an innovation at that time that made it a lot more friendly and playable. Like if you go back and play like Load Runner or whatever, I think Load Runner had jumping, but whatever, you know, all these old platformer games that had jumping.
Even Donkey Kong, I think it just goes a prescribed height.
Yes.
There's no. Is there air control in Donkey Kong? There might not
A
be
little
air control,
bit,
but I don't
maybe,
remember.
but
It might just be either you jump up or you jump sideways. I'm not sure, but it only
Yeah.
always went the same height.
But jumping was very limited for a long time. And so the Super Mario Brothers jump is both much more controllable, both in terms of like holding the button
Yeah.
to control height and air control.
Yes.
Right. And it's also just really big. Like it goes up a large portion of the screen,
Yes.
which is good if you want to give players a lot of freedom about where to go or what to try. All these are good things. And the more control you give them over the jump, the more they have like recovery from slightly not doing the right thing, which means your levels can actually be harder and people can deal with them. Like you can throw more at them and people can deal with them. So these are all good design decisions in the context of that game.
Right.
Now, again, the problem is people look at that and say, oh, therefore, these are good design decisions, period.
Right. Right.
And that is not how it works.
Right.
Right. So, okay, Braid, different game.
Right.
Firstly, I wanted the base rule set to be simple.
Right.
I didn't want you to be solving a lot of puzzles with the base rule set
Right.
because then we're taking up space that would be used by the time stuff or just muddying it. Like if, okay, there are a lot of things in Braid which are of the form, here's a gap that's too wide to jump.
Right.
Clearly you need to get across it.
Right.
How do you do that?
Right.
And that's already kind of an ambiguous situation. Like if you throw that at a player, they're going to try to jump across the gap a little bit, even if it's way too far, right? So that's problem number one.
Especially if they have rewind, right?
Now, if you give them a tool whereby by holding the button more or less, they can jump further or less far, that makes all of those situations both harder for you to design because you have to make it so that the really far jump not only can't cross the gap, but obviously can't cross the gap because it has to be clear to people that they shouldn't be trying to do that. Right. And you're muddying the situation for the player because any situation they're in, they're like, what are the tools that I have to solve this puzzle with? And one of the tools is always going to be the jump button. And that's true in Braid too, but the jump button in Braid does one very simple, well-defined thing. And the less simple and the less well-defined it is, just the less clear in any context that it is to the player whether it's part of the right answer. That's like how you figure out puzzles is you maybe put forth propositions in some way, like maybe it's this, maybe it's that. And some of those you can discount right away. Like, oh yeah, clearly no, because I can't jump that far. And, and the less clear you make that, the harder you make the general puzzle solving process across the entire game, right? So for example, also there's a little bit of momentum on the Braid character movement. There's some speed up and there's a much faster like slow down to stop because you don't want to feel like you're skidding on ice all the time, right? Having no momentum feels really bad. It feels like a crappy indie game, right? Having a lot of momentum, it starts to be a factor in puzzle solving. Like if I already start running before I throw the switch, I can get to the target place sooner than if I throw the switch and then start running. And that's the kind of thing, I don't want that in the solution space of this game ever. I don't want a puzzle where you solve it by already being running when you throw the switch, because that's not about time. That's about like your running mechanics, right?
Not
And
about
so
time.
all of the design of the player mechanics was about this, right? It was about pre-curating it. Before I even know what all the puzzles are going to be exactly, it's about pre-curating it to be simple and not to cause problems. Okay, that's number one.
Right. And so basically all of that stuff you just said, it's very clear. It's like, okay, in Braid, the goal is not really to replicate any of the gameplay from Super Mario Brothers. Super Mario Brothers is about doing these action puzzle sequences where giving players really interesting controls is part of creating the richness of that space.
Yes.
In Braid, the idea is you're supposed to be logically kind of like figuring out what is the correct sequence of events here, not sitting around spending a lot of time figuring out just how to do the air control to like go up through the thing or something like that. So these design decisions are basically have to be different in Braid because the type of thing the player is supposed to be doing is just drastically
I
different.
hope they discuss the stars.
And like the conceptual focus of the game is in a totally different place, right? And you need, as a designer, to be maintaining that at all times.
Okay.
Or maybe they'll just leave it as a secret because they don't want to reveal it to many people. Like, come on, it's a commentary.
So one of the things about the game, we've already said, want it to feel kind of painterly, kind of analog, expressive. It's not a bunch of tiles. And there are places in the game where you would normally, traditionally, just splat out a bitmap a bunch of times, aside from map tiles. So for example, 2-3 is the monster hunt level, where there's like a HUD on top that says hunt, and there's icons of monsters, and you jump on one and it crosses it out. Most games of that time and earlier, there would just be like a monster HUD bitmap and an X bitmap, and you just draw those.
Yes.
And in fact, if you look closely at that level, all of the 6 monster icons are different.
Okay.
And all of the X's are different.
Okay.
Really? Why?
Because it feels a little bit better and it's more in the spirit of the game, right?
Okay.
I didn't even notice that.
Is the kind of thing that I was doing and wanted to do, right?
Okay.
The crosses are different. I don't quite get why. Yeah, like if the player never even realizes it, it doesn't really add anything to it. But I guess it's for the people who do. Alright. Wait. What is that? This is like strange. What? Why is it now portals?
We've discussed the individuation of bitmaps in various places in Braid to provide variety and a handcrafted feeling. But we didn't do this everywhere. For example, the actual monsters that walk around, as well as claws and rabbits, all look the same as each other. In these cases, the issue was just that each enemy is animated, and these animations consist of a series of many bitmaps. So to provide variation, we would have to do multiple large sets of bitmaps, which would be additional work and would also take more memory in the running game. We were having a hard enough time getting all the graphics done, so I decided not to push for this. In the Anniversary Edition, we tint the enemies differently to provide a small amount of variation. I could have done this back then.
I also didn't notice
but
that.
Since it's a small code change only, I'm not sure why I didn't think of it. Doors of one particular kind all look the same as each other, as do keys and gates. But you don't tend to see these replicated in small areas for the most part, so the sameness isn't something the player would tend to notice. In places like the cloud screens, the storybooks and podiums do have different variations. The doors don't, but the number counter that gets placed above them does provide some difference. In retrospect, we should have done several variants of that cloud screen door, though, because the whole point is that we lay them out in a line.
Okay. Why is it still there? Am I missing something? It seems like I do. Keeping puzzles easy to think about. I also feel like I've skipped a lot of commentary. Yeah, holy shit.
At the very first level of World 2, there's a few tutorial-ish things that are just like, here's some puzzle pieces that are kind of easy, that you do various things to get, just to show you the kind of things you do in this game, right? One of the very first ones was, there's one of these platforms that goes, I don't know if this was in the version that you guys play, it might have been.
You mean the first, like, alpha build?
Yeah.
Okay.
There was like a platform, you know, at the very end of what I'm about to say, there's a puzzle piece that you can see, and you're like, I need to get that.
Okay.
So there's a platform with a gap you have to jump across.
Right.
To a narrower platform.
Right.
With another gap to a narrower platform.
Right,
with
yeah.
another gap to a narrower platform with another gap. And there's like 9 platforms increasingly narrow. And like the last ones are absurdly thin compared to your character.
Yes.
Which is kind of bad because like even at that point, it's like you would stand on a platform or not based on whether the center point of your character was located on the span of the platform, right? So it's like, are you supposed to read the game's mind there? But that was like funny because there's no way you would do that in another game, right? That ended up getting taken out. In part, like Microsoft complained about it, but I was also like, yeah, that's been in the game since really early on, and it's no longer quite the quality of experience that I want to have.
Microsoft complained about it?
They did a thing, so in early 2008, when the game was getting close to kind of being done, they did a whole frickin' playtest lab thing about it, right?
Oh, okay.
And they decided to tell me, here is how you should change your game based on the results of the playtest lab. And I said,
oh boy.
Well, this would make more sense if I could see the raw data. And they were like, no, we're not going to send you any data. I, as the producer, am just going to give you my opinion about what you should do. And I was like, no.
Okay.
But I did change that one thing because it was like, you know, sometimes you already kind of know something's not that good. And it's like, all right.
Yeah.
Yeah, someone has opinionated as Jonathan Blow. You don't want to mess. Alright, so we are getting new puzzle pieces which are the same color. It's kind of weird. So this is supposed to be a playtest stuff. But no, this was in the original game. Or something very similar to that. And so, yeah, okay, I see what he was trying to do here. Like, make it a more gradual learning curve that, hey, you can jump on this one and then you need to double jump. Alright. Can I continue to the next? Yeah, I guess this is faster. Good idea about the puzzle frame in World 2. Also, go to the hub. Ah, where those puzzle pieces went? There is a lot that we are 1.5 hours in, and it's just been... I haven't even finished one person here. I need to remember to go back to Chris Moore.
That was one of the theses in the beginning, like I said in the Moriarty talk, or about the Moriarty talk, he was like, it should be totally free. And you were like, it should just be a feature of the system.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay. So I had the high level mission statement. I am not going to cop out by making sand a resource or whatever.
Right.
I absolutely will not do that.
Right.
What I am rather instead going to do is implement the thing and then change the game however is necessary. Okay, so
Right.
a Mario
Yes.
game by itself is proven to be, it can be a good fun game if you do the right things.
Right.
Okay. So you can picture it as I start with a good fun game that's just got lives and whatever.
Right.
Okay. We know what that is. Now I mess it up by putting rewind in.
Right.
It's maybe not fun. It's maybe tedious. It's maybe too easy.
Right.
The knee-jerk reaction that a designer would have is like, okay, limit rewind, or you
Right.
only get it during
Right.
special times.
Right.
I'm not going to do that. I'm instead, the only way out is through. I'm going to see rewind stays constant, and then what else about the game needs to change to make it something different. And I had to just have the faith that I would be able to find that, right? And that was, again, a very experimental gameplay mindset.
So it's sort of like flipping the like arrow of action. It's like saying, look, normally what you would do in game design is you would say, we have to modify the feature to fit the existing game design. And you're doing the opposite. You're saying, let's modify the existing game design to fit the feature.
Yes, and if you think about this in terms of exploring the space of game design, then obviously you don't want to retreat back into what is known, but that's
Right.
what almost everybody does all the time.
And if you're modifying the feature, you're sort of by definition saying that's what you're going to do because you're keeping the other side, which is the
Yes.
gameplay, constant.
And I believe, I don't remember a lot of what that conversation on the mailing list was, but I bet some of it was like that. Like, well, you know, you ruin consequence and you make the game too easy and all that stuff.
Yes.
But you could mitigate that in the following ways.
Right, right.
And absolutely nobody said, design a whole new game around rewind. So on 2, 3, after you go down the pit, you go straight back up the other side.
Yes.
And there's like guys falling down and there's compartments on the side.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember there being a level in like Yoshi's Island or something like that that was exactly that.
Okay.
And this one's more unfair. It's like the guy comes down way faster.
Right.
And you don't get as good of an audio cue and stuff. And
Right.
so it's actually, it's a little bit like frustrating, right? But it's designed to illustrate this idea. Although the illustration may be very subtle and not gotten by a lot of people who don't think about game design, right? And so you can attempt it again and attempt
Yeah.
it again, which you would do in a normal video game, but with a much longer sort of
Right.
experiment loop, because you probably respawn somewhere earlier in the level and at cost to you,
Right.
which is why it's unfair, right?
Right.
Because you lose lives or whatever.
Right.
And here it's like that doesn't happen, right? On this same initial 1 week thing,
Yeah.
I have plenty of free headspace because I'm chilling, I'm on vacation, everything's good. And I'm excited about this idea. And I've typed in the rewind code, and it works by telling you what fields of entities have changed.
Right.
And so there's an outer loop
What?
that's for all entities in the world.
Right.
And there's an inner loop that's for all fields in this entity,
Right.
and transmit that information to the rewind buffer or
Right.
whatever.
Right.
You don't exactly know where this idea comes from, but it's a very simple idea that I just have. Maybe I woke up with it, or
Mhm.
maybe I was just chilling, but I was like, you know, like if there was a bug or something, or maybe I could just do it intentionally, just some of those objects are not visited by that loop.
Right.
Right? And then that gives me two classes of things. It gives me things that always go forward in time and things that
Right.
rewind in time. And right away, like even as soon as I have that idea, like I don't know what to do with it yet,
Yeah.
but it's like, oh, that is the kind of cool and weird and expanding the rewind idea that I'm looking for. Right?
It feels, just as you say it, to be very in line with like the Calvino Invisible Cities kind of thing, where it's like, oh, there's these kind of like different permutations of things happening as I go through.
Yes.
And I don't know the Einstein Dream one, but I assume that was kind of similar. Like there would be, it's the kind of thing you would see in that kind of work, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, it's weird reality, basically.
Yeah.
But it still has all the character or all the, like, it's still a system with well-defined rules, in fact.
Right.
Right? So as soon as I had that idea, that was pretty easy to put in. And then as soon as I had that idea, I was like, what else can I do with the rewind? And I know that I did 3 worlds in that initial beta. And I think it was literally what's now World 2, 3, 4, right? So World 2 is rewind.
Right.
World 3 is rewind with objects that are exempt to rewind.
Right.
And World 4 is time is tied to space. And I think there was just like one level of that.
That's
too at the
like,
end.
Right.
that's my
In
favorite
fact, I think
one.
it was t equals x and then t equals y. Which, there's no t equals y in the final game.
Right. Yes.
Yeah.
Doing metaphor in a game rather than a book. Initial discussions about the rewind and the original story screens worked differently. I'm pretty sure like each book represents the commentary track. So there should be 3 here.
So it wasn't like the first time you read Calvino, you were just thinking it would be cool to make a game like this sometime.
No, not at all.
It was actually much closer to the actual time of making Braid that you first started thinking like, hey,
Yeah.
it would be neat to do something like that. Those books that I read.
Yeah, and specifically what I was thinking was, well, you know, in a story, you can just sort of postulate whatever the laws of physics are. Like, okay, the moon comes really close and it pulls the ground up and stuff, right? Doesn't exactly work that way in a game, especially like the more systemic the game is, the more you kind of can't just cheat that sort of thing. You have to more make a system that exhibits those properties. And that to me is more magical. Right. I was like, there's something cool, and if it's hard, it seems very hard, but if you can do it, it's a little bit more groundbreaking than just doing a story about the thing, right?
Yeah.
In the field of games, it's a thing that very few people had done. Now, there were other games that did analogies of this sort, right? So one of the earliest ones was Rod Humble's game, The Marriage, which I had shown at EGW, which like there's 2 people in this relationship and they're just colored squares on the screen, and you move them around and some stuff happens, and you know, and then Jason Rohrer actually had done these 2 games, Passage and Gravitation. I think they also engage in this kind of analogy where there's a system of rules, and those rules are expressive about the situation that the game's about, right? It's not just the plot and the fiction that the game is about, but the rules of the universe that are being set up are expressive of what the game is about. And so I wanted to do something like that. And I wanted to do it about physics because, you know, quantum mechanics, for example, is pretty weird, as is relativity, right? And I thought it would be fun to take that weirdness and instead of, you know, conflating it with human scale things in a fiction kind of way, like those stories do, let's conflate it with human level things by just making the phenomena happen on a human scale.
Right.
And then just like seeing what happens and seeing how to make a game out of that. And that'll be fun and interesting. Like, you know, if there's quantum superposition or something and something's at multiple places until the waveform gets localized, that's one idea, right? Or one thing that comes up in physics a lot is time being bidirectional, right? So, which is even true back in Newtonian physics, but also in relativity and stuff. And so what does that mean? How do you make a game where time is bidirectional? It's challenging because it seems like almost you can't make anything happen. Right. Because it would have to be a completely pre-recorded sequence for you to go forward and backward. And so what does that mean? And so those questions were just in the air.
I see. They're kicking around in your head, growing over time, somewhere in the 2003, 2004 kind of.
Yeah, it may not have even been that. It may have been just the few months before.
So like 2004-ish times. Then,
But you can see like how these are they're both difficult questions to answer.
Yes.
And also not very actionable until you have a good answer.
Right. Yeah, you're not really going to be able to do much until you get something to hold on to.
Yeah.
All right. I think I'll continue later because I gotta go now. Very interesting. Still kind of hope for actually getting to some kind of new levels as well. I mean, the commentary is interesting, though at some parts it's a bit repetitive because it seems like he talked with like a lot of people, but also talked about the same thing, trying to do a different angle, but it still kind of repeats itself. Yeah, I mean, it's still a pretty cool commentary. I wonder how much I'll be able to learn from that. That part about the inspiration from Einstein's dream and what was the first one? Invisible cities? That I didn't know. Alright. Well, see you around, guys.